Okay, well, good morning. Um, Today, we're going to talk about hope and despair. Originally, the title of my sermon was Despair, but that didn't really seem so great. So I managed to find some hope. So, hope and despair. Um, COVID-19. So I've feel like somewhat saturated with all the news about COVID-19, which I'm sure is true for many of you. So I hesitate to talk about it, but it's so relevant when we're talking about despair. And I we're literally living through history being made right now. And it's very significant time. It's kind of like, it's a worldwide pandemic. It's kind of like World War II. Like everything is changing. And it definitely bears reflection on it. Um, Specifically today, we're going to be talking about despair. So that's definitely a side effect of what we're going through right now. And for some people, it's a lot worse than others. I know personally, it hasn't been so bad because I work in construction and my job has been more or less the same as usual. Um, it's for me, the biggest thing really has been missing church and preaching to a computer screen instead of getting to see everyone. And that is definitely a hole in my life. But I know for other people, it's been a lot harder and they've lost their jobs and are wondering how they're going to pay their bills, or they've lost relationships and they're extremely isolated and lonely. So it's not a big step to fall into despair in those situations. And especially because there's so many unknowns. We don't know when this will end. We don't know what the new normal. I mean, we're getting a sense now that we're living in the new normal for now, but we don't really know for how long, and we don't know what that means. And it's a very uprooted kind of time to be living. So it's for people who like stability, which is most of us, it's a very difficult time. So let's look at today's passage, and we'll be looking at 1 Kings 19, which is about the prophet Elijah. I'm going to read it to you, starting in verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up, ate, and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord." for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood on the face of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escaped the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escaped the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So here's a little map of his journey. Kind of a blurry map. You can see he started in the top there. Mount Carmel was, and then he moved to Jezreel, and then walked down to Beersheba there in the middle of the map, and then the long journey to Mount Horeb. So let's start with 1 Kings 18, which is the backstory, which you kind of need to know to understand what's going on here. So in 1 Kings 18, there's a big standoff between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And it's kind of like this contest to see who can offer a sacrifice to God. So the prophets of Baal prepare their sacrifice. There's 450 of them. They prophesy all day, and nothing happens. So after that, Elijah comes to his altar, and he just prays to God, and fire comes down from heaven and licks up his sacrifice. So just a profoundly strong statement that God is God, and the people watching join Elijah in killing all the prophets of Baal. It's quite dramatic. And then after that, because, that wasn't enough, Israel had been in famine for years, in drought, and Elijah prayed to God, and it started raining. So yet another demonstration of God's power through Elijah. And the very next day, Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, says this, threatens Elijah's life, and Elijah runs. So Elijah is not feeling the strength anymore that he did the day before. And in fact, he is greatly discouraged, so he ends up in the desert by Beersheba, saying, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." So extremely discouraged, despairing even. And what is God's response is great. He just supports him. He gives him food and water. He gives him the shelter of a plant. He gives him rest. He sleeps. But Elijah isn't done yet. Elijah journeys 40 days and 40 nights into the desert further to go to Mount Horeb, which is also another name for Mount Sinai. Now, this journey should only take about 12 days, so um, something's going on here. And I think what's going on is the symbolism of the number 40 is just that of a time of, it echoes back to the Israelites in the desert and a time of closeness, or sorry, a time of scarcity and a time of discipline. Um, reminds us also of the time of Jesus in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights. So Elijah was alone in the desert, dealing with his stuff, thinking about his stuff and what happened. And he goes to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses met with God after the Israelites left Egypt and where the Ten Commandments came. So a holy place full of meaning. And there he meets with God. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, so there he meets with God. This is, and it's interesting that God was not in the dramatic large events. He wasn't in the earthquake. He wasn't in the wind. He wasn't in the fire, but he was in the quiet. This is something that's kind of debated as to what God was going on about here, but I think that God was telling Elijah, showing Elijah his power, first of all, and then also saying that the small things have significance. So, what happened to Elijah? He was at the pinnacle event of his life. This was the highlight of his career. Career as a prophet. Not that that's really a career, a calling. And all these dramatic events happened, and there's seemingly no results other than a threat against his life. So he's profoundly disappointed that this is how things have gone. And he loses hope. And he feels like his life has been futility. So there's despair to do with his life, but there's also despair about the state of Israel because he feels like the nation of Israel will never be okay. They're never going to turn back to God. So he's despairing that as well. And also Elijah's exhausted. It was a lot. It was a lot of things happened during that day, and he's physically, emotionally, and spiritually exhausted. So God gives him food and drink and rest, which helps. And he was also lonely. Elijah felt alone. He felt like no one was with him. He was the only prophet of Baal left. And God's response is very telling, because it's not much of a response. God basically just lets him work through it. God supports him by giving him food, water, sleep, but doesn't reprimand him, doesn't tell him, smarten up, what are you doing? He lets Elijah spend a month dwelling in this place before he meets with him. And judging by Elijah's words, not much has changed about how Elijah's feeling. So Elijah, God gives Elijah space. And after that space, God shows Elijah his power and then gives Elijah some specific tasks to do. And a lot of times when we're in despair or in a difficult place, we really need just a bit of a kick in the butt, just to even do some very simple, specific tasks. Like, I know during the early days of COVID, when we were under lockdown, I listened to CBC radio a lot, and they had people call in, and the challenge they had put out to people was to do 3 things. Just do 3 things today. So people would call in and say, well, I brushed my teeth today. Like, yes, you did it. You've done one good thing. And the point was just to, it's so easy just to dwell in the despair. And the point was do something that, like, clean the house or do the dishes or do something that gets something positive going. And that's what God does here. He gives Elijah specific tasks that are dealing with specific problems. And God also through the showing of God's power, he shows Elijah that he is God, that he is bigger than all of this, that Elijah's despair for the nation of Israel is not something he needs to worry about because God's got it under control. And this is your part, Elijah. And God also reminds Elijah that he's not alone. There are, 7,000 people who have not worshipped Baal. So even though he feels alone, he's not. So let's take a little excursus here to the world of despair. Discouragement, despair, and depression. Let's start with discouragement. So discouragement's when you lose confidence or enthusiasm for something. So like I was discouraged at work today because things didn't go as I wanted them to. Things took longer. So it's kind of a small, things aren't great. Despair is much worse. Despair is when you have a complete loss of all hope. Yeah, hard to find your way out of that one. That's and often there is no hope because there is no purpose. You can't see beyond the moment. Depression is worse. Definitely worse because one of the main symptoms of depression is a loss of interest or a loss of feeling of pleasure in certain activities that usually bring joy to people. So if you're depressed, it is very hard to live a life. It's hard to do the everyday things that you need to do. Whereas in despair, you still can. So I think we can safely say that Elijah was in despair here. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, gave this formula for despair. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. So despair comes about if we're suffering for no apparent purpose. If we're suffering for a purpose, we can endure quite a bit. Like parenting. Honestly, parenting involves a fair bit of suffering with a purpose. But one of the things that makes COVID so hard is we're suffering and there doesn't really seem to be a purpose, and we feel helpless to do anything about it. So the helplessness or lack of control also enter into the equation and make despair worse. But Elijah was not the only one who's felt this way. So let's look at Moses in Numbers 11. Moses is in the desert with the Israelites, and they're sick of manna every day, so they want some meat. So Moses complains to God, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you, that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on an oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these burdens by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me right now. If I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own room. So he's feeling pretty bleak there. And there's other examples in scriptures. Jeremiah, if you read the book of Jeremiah, there's often where he's despairing. Job, absolutely, Job is in despair because he is suffering without reason, and his friends are not super helpful. They're just telling him what he did wrong. They're not really supporting him. And I myself, I've been through a season of despair, and it kind of started with a bit of a midlife crisis, just a bit of a looking at my life and thinking, well, how did I get here? And not feeling very happy at things in my life. And yeah, just and not feeling like there was a lot of hope for the future other than just endless days of going to work. Just going to work and coming home and sleeping and eating, and there didn't seem to be anything else to look forward to. So there was definitely a season where I didn't see much hope. I've done some changes in my life, and I've managed to find more meaning, and I've gotten better at self-care. So I think I'm largely through the other side, but I can relate to Elijah to a degree where he feels like his life has been without purpose. And it's not true, but if you start to get into the dark side, it's hard to see all the good. And sometimes someone has to remind you of the good. So this has been pretty bleak. Hopefully I'll get more positive soon. So here's some observations from the passage. Everyone gets discouraged and despairing sometimes. That's life. And the trite answers of pray more, worship more, God is in control. The one I really hate is you don't have it so bad. Like, look at these people in this part of the world. Look how much they're suffering. Well, okay, I acknowledge their suffering, but it doesn't mitigate mine. I still experience mine. So these aren't very helpful things to say. I think there's a certain amount of holiness when people are hurting, which seems ridiculous, but like there's a sense where we need to have we need to give them room. We need to be there and present, but give them room. And just let God and just listen and not offer useless advice. And it's very important to recognize the pain and give room for the pain. And I've tried denial for years, and it really is not a solution to many of life's problems. So I wouldn't recommend that. You have to recognize and name the pain that you're feeling. And that's part of working through it. And never forget God is always there. He is really not overwhelmed by any of our problems. He's greater and he loves us, and he will see us through. And it takes time. So don't be too hard on yourself. It takes time to get past things. And that's one of the hard things. And it's a hard thing with this COVID thing is it's going to take time. Like life goes on, but we don't really know what it's going to look like. And it's going to take years before we kind of sort out what's going to happen. Important to keep communicating with God in the midst of your despair, which I'm not very good at, but I believe it to be true. So you should do it, even if I don't. We see it in the Bible, Job and others, and David, who wrote a lot of Psalms, often complains to God. And it shows the importance of telling God how we feel. So I think we'll read a psalm now as an example of how it can work. So Psalm 56, be merciful to me, my God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. My adversaries pursue me all day long. In their pride, many are attacking me. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, and am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? All day long they twist my words. All their schemes are for my ruin. They conspire, they lurk, they watch my steps, hoping to take my life. Because of their wickedness, do not let them escape. In your anger, God, bring the nations down. Record my misery, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record? Then my enemies will turn back when I call for help. By this I will know that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust, and I am not afraid. What can man do to me? I am under vows to you, my God. I will present my thank offerings to you, for you have delivered me from death and my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. So that's encouraging, no? David starts in despair. He complains to God about the problems in his life, but he's reminded of how powerful and good God is. And it ends in worship, as a lot of Psalms do. So that's a good pattern for us to follow. So just a few finishing thoughts. A lot of similarities between the story of Elijah and, things going bad for him, and just the sense of hopelessness he feels, and how we might be feeling today with COVID-19 and just the unknowns of all that and the difficulties it's brought into our lives. So bad things happen, even if we're following God. The Bible is very clear on that. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't care or doesn't exist or isn't powerful. It just means we're alive. And the key in difficult times is to stay close to God and to be patient and persevere. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and you'll get to the other side. God's bigger than all our problems, and he cares for us. Yep. Okay, so here's a closing prayer, and then I'll give you a few questions. Blessed are all your saints, O God and King, who have traveled over the tempestuous sea of this life and have made the harbor of peace and felicity. Watch over us now. Watch over us who are still on our dangerous voyage, and remember those who lie exposed to the rough storms of trouble and temptations. Frail is our vessel, and the ocean is wide, but in your mercy you have set our course. So steer the vessel of our life towards the everlasting shore of peace, and bring us at length to the quiet haven of our heart's desire, where you, O God, are blessed and live and reign forever. Amen. So may God bless you and give you hope in the midst of these difficult times. And here's a few questions that we can discuss later, which will be posted later as well.